Okay, so throughout this semester, we've talked about what it means to write against the grain, to harness the power of resistance through writing in order to expose and thus challenge oppressive mechanisms of power. We've questioned our understandings of good and serious writing, coming to realize that such labels are defined by normative and limiting views of literature. We've also questioned our very understanding of what counts as writing through exploring different forms of literature. This has been something, the idea of what counts as writing, that I have been grappling with all semester. But I know now, after studying these various works, that there is a power to visual literacy, spoken word, and movement. For example, in The Complete Persepolis, Marjane Satrapi portrays her experiences as a young woman growing up in Tehran and Europe during the Iranian Revolution. There are often points when she portrays herself struggling with her identity. For example, when she goes to Europe, she talks about starting to assimilate. There are illustrations that show her changing her appearance, starting to do drugs, and about this she writes, "The harder I tried to assimilate, the more I had the feeling that I was distancing myself from my culture, betraying my parents and my origins, that I was playing a game by somebody else's rules." So although it may seem that she's not being authentic to herself in this book, she is authentically portraying her struggles with her identity, and other traumatic events that she must deal with as a result of the violence, gender depression, and racism that arose during this time of political and religious turmoil. Another event in her life that she depicts is witnessing the aftermath of her 14-year-old neighbor's death. About this she writes, "No scream in the world could have removed my suffering and my anger." And the accompanying illustration is this black box. In turn, Satrapi not only gives voice to her own experiences as a member of a marginalized group, but she also pays tribute to the silenced experiences of many people like her. This is important because it's a huge part of writing against the grain, and Satrapi does this through the use of images in conjunction with text. Now, For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, Nidazaki Shange gives voice to Black women who experience oppression in a racist, sexist world. A choreo poem, the piece uses poetry, monologue, movement, music, and dance to provide space and freedom for the women to express themselves. At the end of the piece, on page 87 in this edition, the women join together in a circle in a lane of hands, and they repeat to themselves, "I found God in myself, and I loved her. I loved her fiercely." This demonstrates how it is through sharing their individual experiences and connecting with one another that the women realize their common oppression. They also come to develop a sense of individual identity and strength. So I now understand that the alternative forms we've read that expand upon the traditional idea of writing can help to cultivate self-realization for readers and also promote understanding across cultures in an accessible and versatile way. But as someone who loves writing and was drawn to this course because of the literature aspect, I still find myself caught up in what I think of as the inherent power of writing that I think limits my understanding. This has been something that I've been forced to think about a lot in all of my classes this semester. For example, in my Intro to Feminist Thought class, we discuss the idea of the gap between theory and practice, and thought critically about if high-level feminist theory that is inaccessible to the very people it is being written about can be effective and productive in producing knowledge and creating understanding. I was reminded of this in our class when Barbie shared that video from The Onion that was called "Trump Voter Betrayed by President After Reading 800 Pages of Queer Feminist Theory." After watching that, I began to think about if something like a graphic novel or a choreo poem would be a better way to reach a wider variety of people. If more people can flip through the pages of these graphic novels by Satrapi or Barry, or read aloud or even view shonges for colored girls, and understand the oppressive dynamics related to race and class and gender that are embedded within these images and words and movement, then these forms of expression should definitely be viewed as valuable sources for generating knowledge, awareness, and understanding about systemic privilege and oppression. Now, this idea of what we think of as valid is something that also came up in my Latin American literature course. We read this one essay in this textbook by Mario Vargas Llosa that's called La Literatura y la Vida, or Literature and Life, where he talks about the power of literature to promote understanding and knowledge and generate culture. But when he's talking about this, he's talking about the written word. He says, "Estoy convencido de que una sociedad sin literatura está condenada a barbarizarse espiritualmente y a comprometer su libertad." So essentially here, he's saying that a society without literature is condemned to spiritual barbarity and that their liberty is compromised, which is just such a narrow view. He goes on to say that literature is una actividad irreemplazable para la formación del ciudadano en una sociedad moderna y democrática. So, literature is an irreplaceable activity for the formation of the citizen in a modern and democratic society, is what he's saying there. So, these are ideas that completely ignore the knowledge, the power, and the validity of societies without a written language. Which brings me to something that we talked about in my Native American spiritualities class. The idea that written history should not be valued over oral history, and that maybe things other than writing should be considered writing. Things like ritual performances and sand paintings and other markings. In one of the books we read, called "We Will Dance Our Truth, Yaqui History in Yoemi Performances," David Delgado Shorter writes this one chapter called "Reconsidering Writing and the Proof of History," where he talks about this strategy by another scholar to deconstruct the oral literate dichotomy. Shorter talks about this oral literate dichotomy as problematic because it produces the idea that cultures without the dominant understanding of writing, cultures without a written language, that they're uncivilized or less human. And this is a notion that has been held historically by European colonizers and others seeking to subordinate people. Furthermore, this dichotomy also produces the idea that history is the same as writing, that these two things are equated, and thus that oral histories, such as traditional stories from native groups, that they're not seen as valid forms of points of reference. Clearly, this is a limiting view. The value of writing over oral history and other forms of communication is oppressive to various groups of people, and it cultivates a more narrow body of knowledge. By breaking down this oral literate dichotomy through alternative forms of writing, more voices can literally be heard. More experiences can be understood, and more oppressive mechanisms of power can be challenged. This is why I decided to talk about all of this rather than write it down. although I am going to submit a written version of it, which kind of defeats the point of what I'm trying to do, but that's besides the point right now. When it comes down to it, I still believe in the power of writing against the grain. However, I think we need to expand our understanding of writing.